Welcome, everyone. I see our attendees trooping in. So I'll give it just a minute or two to have folks enter the webinar and get settled. All right, I see our participant list are stabilized. I will get started and others will join when they can. Welcome to all our guests joining us from your various locations. We are excited to have you here today. My name is Benjamin Olayele. I have the privilege of serving as the president of IPAC Saskatchewan. I will be bringing you some greetings and introduce our panel later today. I understand some folks are joining us from outside of Saskatchewan as well. Please drop your name in the chat and tell us where you're joining us from. Before we get started, I would like to draw your attention to a dedicated question and answer chat box. It should be at the very bottom of your screen. If you have any questions that you would like to pose to the panel during the discussion, please drop these questions in the chat box. After the panel discussion, we have allocated 15 minutes for the panelists to answer questions from the audience. My colleagues at the back end will actively monitor the chat box for questions. Feel free to send your questions. Now that we've finished the housekeeping, let's get this started. Good afternoon. I want to begin by acknowledging that I'm joining today's discussion from Regina, Saskatchewan. I'm located on Treaty 4 territory, the traditional lands of the Cree, Ojibwe, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. At IPAC Saskatchewan, we are deeply committed to our Indigenous partnerships and are thankful for the opportunities to work together, work on this great land, and serve as public servants for the betterment of our communities. Wherever you are on your truth and reconciliation journey, I encourage you to reflect on the Night 4 calls to action and continue exploring how you can act on commitments that support truth and reconciliation as a public servant in our community. We are gathered here today to learn from a diverse panel of exceptional experts on how innovation can enhance public service delivery and meet the changing needs of Canadians. This event is one of many events organized by IPAC Saskatchewan. IPAC is the Institute of Public Administration of Canada, Canada's leading professional organization supporting excellence in the country's public sector. Our members are from all levels of government, academia, and others interested in public administration. The Saskatchewan Regional Group is one of 19 regional groups across Canada. Since our establishment, we have become a recognized leader in championing public policy discourse and providing networking and professional development opportunities for professionals at all stages of their careers. Our membership offerings range from student packages, to new professionals, seasoned professionals, and retirees. At this moment, I invite you to learn more about IPAC's work and the advantages of membership by visiting the IPAC website. In the next 45 to 50 minutes, our distinguished panel will discuss how innovation can enhance public service delivery and meet the changing needs of Canadians. But before I do that, and before we go into this discussion, I would like to introduce my favorite professor back when I was in policy school, Dr. Justin Longo, our esteemed moderator for today. Justin Longo is an associate professor at the Johnson Shoyama Graduate School of Public Policy at the University of Regina, where he directs the Digital Governance Lab. He has a PhD in public policy and public administration from the University of Victoria, where he researched the use of enterprise social collaboration platforms in government policy analysis settings. Following postdoctoral work in open governance at Arizona State University and the GovLab at New York University, he joined the University of Regina as the Cisco Research Chair in Digital Governance. His current research focuses on the social, organizational, and political implications of advancing technology. This includes the impact of the sharing economy on social and governance arrangements, as well as the unanticipated consequences of policy analytics and artificial intelligence. His commitment to digital governance and extensive experience in moderating high-level discussions make him the perfect person to guide us through today's conversation. And before I pass it over to Justin, I would like to extend my sincere gratitude and appreciation for the exceptional efforts of the programs team for putting today's program together. Faith Babalola, Charis, and Amber, thank you so much. At this point, I would like to pass it over to our moderator for the event, Justin, to take it from here. Thank you, Justin.
Thank you, Ben. So yeah, I hope I can live up to that introduction. I really do appreciate that. It's very kind of you. You know, everybody, one of the benefits of being in a position like myself and my colleague Peter Phillips, of being an instructor and professor in a school of public administration is having graduates like Ben go on to such success in their careers. It really is its own reward to see people excel in their careers. And Ben, as one of our esteemed graduates, really lives up to that, the expectations that we had for him when he was in our program. Again, good afternoon, everybody. Yes, my name is Justin Longo, Associate Professor in Johnson Shoyama, and it's my pleasure to moderate this panel today. I want to introduce you to the panel members. We're going to get straight into a discussion with them. Let me start with Sonia Gulati, who's a partner with the Government and Public Sector Division of KPMG Canada. Sunil Johal is the David and Ann Wilson Professor in Public Policy and Society at Victoria College of the University of Toronto. And Peter Phillips is Distinguished University Professor Emeritus, Johnson Shoyama Graduate School at the University of Saskatchewan. So again, welcome everybody. And I'd like to start off this discussion sort of, if we could ground ourselves in a definition. And Peter, I'd like to go to you. Could you just tell us what is innovation in the public sector? Could you define it for us and give us a sense of the parameters?
Innovation in the public sector isn't any different than innovation anywhere else. I mean, the most basic one is that it's about doing something, bringing new products, services, technologies, processes, organizations, markets to use. In the public sector, a lot of that gets lost because we tend to think that the inputs and the outputs aren't as clean. But generally, it's about recombining things. It's not necessarily about invention. Invention is often, it's what we all spend a lot of time on. But the reality is that the things that have the most impact on institutions and people writ large is just finding new ways of using old things, or perhaps old ways of doing new things. And so there's a bit of too much idolatry of innovation as special things done by special people in special places. You're all innovators. You may not recognize it, you may not book it as that, but innovation is we're hardwired to do it. We just tweak our lives to make them better.
Excellent. That's a really good start. And it does give me that confidence that we all have a place a role to play in this. Sunil Johal, tell me what is interesting about innovation to you. Why are you drawn to this field and focus on it?
Sure. And thanks, Justin, and thanks to IPAC Saskatchewan for having me on the panel. Really looking forward to the discussion today. So I think innovation is a really important topic right now for everybody in Canada, but if we think about it in the context of the public sector, I mean, we're facing a mounting and daunting array of challenges. So whether we're talking about climate change, productivity, homelessness, mental health, healthcare crisis more generally, and the challenge for Canadian public servants and political elected officials is that there's not a lot of new money coming down the pipe to help tackle these problems. I mean, in years past, we could kind of just throw money at problems and hope that would either completely get the problem to go away or go some way towards getting the problem to go away. But we know our economic growth rate is slowing, our population is aging, we're going to have fewer people in the kind of prime working age to generate tax revenues to fund public services going forward. So that really does put a big spotlight on the public service and on Canadian governments more generally to innovate. So, I mean, to Peter's point, think about new ways of doing things, combining old ways with new ways of doing things, all to the kind of ultimate objective of getting to better outcomes for Canadians in all of those areas that I mentioned, plus a whole host of others that I didn't even have time to mention. So, I mean, innovation is always important. We always want to be kind of trying out new approaches, testing them, seeing what works, seeing what doesn't work, deploying and scaling those things that do work at a larger level, whether that's at the federal level or at a provincial or municipal level too. But that imperative is greater than ever now, just given that kind of tension point between the sheer scale and magnitude of the problems and challenges that we're facing, and the fact that we're just not going to have dollars to throw at those problems in the same way that we did in the past.
Okay, that's excellent. Thanks, Sunil. Sonia, are you on the call yet? I can't tell if you have joined yet.
Yes, I'm on the call.
Okay, great. Thanks, Sonia. Nice to have you with us. So let's focus on public service delivery, because Sunil sort of sketched the broad range of problems that we are faced with trying to solve. What's the relationship between innovation and specifically about public service delivery?
I think the expectations have changed from a customer service, citizen service perspective. And so if you think about pandemic and if you think about how citizens interact with government, the needs and the expectations continue to grow and continue to change and continue to evolve. So from a citizen perspective, they see no difference in how they interact with government as if they interact with their bank, for instance. They want those options. They want to be able to have self-service options, have government work and integrate within their lifestyle so that they don't have to wait for a passport for 2 days, whether they go and they renew their driver's license. And so I think there's constantly a need for innovation. And I agree wholeheartedly with Peter's point, which is innovation is no different in the public sector versus the private sector. But I think from a citizen service perspective, the expectations are the same, regardless of what sector you're in. And we're seeing that change significantly. And I think the pandemic really helped kind of drive that and kind of once again heighten the need for innovation from that perspective.
That's really interesting. I remember years ago, the minister of, I forget the exact title, digital services or something like that, Scott Bryson, had a line which he definitely liked, which was the government of Canada was a blockbuster government in a Netflix world, and that it needed to adapt to the new way of people's expectations, the way that, as you say, their expectations around applying for and getting a new passport. Peter, is there, though, some kind of clash in the culture of the public sector that inhibits innovation, or the sort of the lack of reward for risk taking, the the chance that you might get it wrong, or just the kind of ethos of the public sector that we don't do different things around here? Is that a problem, or am I overestimating that?
I think there's two orders of problem here. One is how we deal with the individual. Unlike in the corporate world where there's profit sharing, where there's bonuses, where there's a whole array of ways of compensating people monetarily, the bureaucracy doesn't have that. So there's a limit on how we externally motivate them. All the internal motivations are there. You know, make the job exciting, give people some degrees of freedom, don't overmanage them, rewards, you know, acknowledge success, don't berate people from failure. Those are important across all spaces where you want to innovate. But the public sector sometimes is risk avoidant rather than risk seeking, and so they put more onus on the failures than the success. So there's you know, that's true in most parts of the public sector, universities, health system. You know, expertise and success isn't always recognized. There's a higher order problem though, and that is that in the industrial space, when you innovate, you usually produce something that's absolutely new that generates significant profits in new markets and new market share, or you reduce costs, both of which can be measured in the commercial space and can be monetized and can be shared about. In the public space, we have a problem. We have pretty much infinite demand because we don't price anything. So we don't ever choke anybody out of a market by pricing. We do it by queues and other things. And similarly, we have a constrained set of resources. In the private sector, if something is working, more money will flow. In the public sector, that's not always true. Sometimes success breeds its own failure because people say, hey, we put money into that and it's succeeding. Now we can take it away and put it in somewhere else that's lagging. So there's both at the individual level, we don't have the right incentives. We've got the right tools there at the to work with individuals, but we need something different to incentivize them. And then at the system level, there's no real win. And so you get this risk avoidant practice that happens across the space, and it compounds the lethargy of the government at times.
Yeah, very interesting. Sunil, does that resonate with you? Especially, I'm thinking about the kind of for the individual, the incentives that are misaligned. There isn't a culture of risk taking, and how do we overcome that?
Yeah, I don't disagree with anything Peter said. I would just kind of maybe add or highlight a couple of points. I mean, when you see the surveys of public servants at different levels of government, and they're asked, do you feel that you're incentivized or encouraged to take risk or to innovate? I mean, usually you see about half the people say yes, half the people say no, which isn't a particularly great number. And I really do think I mean, I've worked in government in and out of all three levels of government in large hierarchical organizations, and especially in a public sector context, there's definitely incentives to keep your head down and don't get noticed. Like, kind of just the worst thing in the world for you as a public servant is to have your name in the newspaper, because that means something has gone catastrophically wrong. I wrote a piece a few years ago when I was at a think tank at U of T saying, kind of tongue-in-cheek, but maybe not fully tongue-in-cheek, that governments should create a ministry of failure. They should kind of create an entity where risk-taking and trying things and failing is actually encouraged. Because I really do feel that the incentives right now for many public servants are keep your head down, keep kind of progressing incrementally, do a little bit better. We'll try a little bit of a new thing here or there. But that transformational big bang innovation it's too risky. That's the perspective. And I mean, that also comes from political leadership. I mean, the last thing a minister or a prime minister or a premier wants is really innovative, risk-taking public servants burning through tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars, piloting a new scheme that ends up not working. I think Peter's point around the market signals is really important here too. You just don't get those same market signals in the public sector that what you're trying is working or not working. So the public servants are often operating in a bit of a vacuum. Like, we think this approach might be better, but it's really hard for us to measure and test whether it actually is better or it's delivering better results or not. And I mean, if you look at private sector firms that are known for being innovative. I mean, like a Google or something like that, like they are constantly trialing new products, new services at a small scale, and they immediately have real-time data on how many people are using those services, how long are they spending on a website or on an app. People in the public sector just don't have that kind of insight. So it makes it doubly difficult to innovate when you don't have those feedback loops and you can't kind of see what's working or not working layered on top of the silos, the difficulty in collaborating, whether it's internal to government or with external partners, which is a kind of necessary precondition of innovation, is that collaboration piece. So I could go on and on and on about this, but I'll try and stay more optimistic and maybe turn it back to you, Justin.
Well, let me follow up on that point with Sonia, and to pick up on Sunil's point, Sonia, about Google, for example. So Google, and my experience in digital governance is that Google does what I call continual experimentation and feedback, what I call A/B testing. So they'll put out a new version of a slightly tweaked version of a website to see how it resonates with respondents or people who are using the site, and test that against the original. And to see whether the new innovation is more effective, whether it causes people to get their task done more easily, whether they stay on the site, whatever the measure is. Is that kind of technology-based experimentation available to governments in your experience, or is that something that governments don't really want to experiment with?
So, like Sunil, I was a former civil servant as well with both the federal and provincial government here in Ontario. And I would say that innovation does occur within the public sector, but I think it's this difference between innovation, big I innovation, small I innovation, if that's a term, but let's coin the term through the conversation of I think change is happening, continuous improvement is happening. I have so many clients of mine, so many friends of mine who currently work in the civil service, and I think that they would argue that they are innovative. But I think they're also trying to be innovative in a very with sometimes a lot of constraints. And so when you're sort of thinking about technology, I would say most of the civil service wants to embrace the technology, but the risk standards are very high, right? And so I was at the IPAC National Conference, I think 6 months ago or 8 months ago, and there were elected officials from the federal government in the room. And the question was sort of posed, which was, and this was federal civil servants providing feedback to elected officials, which is, it worked during the pandemic because all red tape, so to speak, was removed, and they were able to sort of do things differently. But now post-pandemic, everything has kind of gone back to normal, and it's more difficult in order to do that. So I think elected officials were frustrated going, well, why can't you do it? You used to do a vaccine passport and you were able to do that in 2 weeks. Why can't you keep up that pace? And I think it goes back to, I think, what Sunil and Peter have been talking about, which is having a culture that allows for that innovative approach, but also recognition that failure is okay. You don't want to be in a situation where failure occurs at $150 million or $250 million in terms of loss, but you need to prototype, and that's the whole basis of innovation, and it's allowing for that culture so that you can do it within the constructs of government. You can break down those silos, but that it's not necessarily that you're incentivized, but you're not having your knuckles wrapped in doing that. And I think that's, more the mindset of why innovate if you're just going to get in trouble. And I think that's not necessarily the same headspace or the same culture that a Google would have, for instance.
Okay. And just if I could on that point, just to a brief tangent on the ArriveCAN app and the scandal revolving around that. That's different than a failure, right? ArriveCAN and the sort of the ballooning of that contract is a different issue than the kind of when we talk about failure and innovation. Just would you agree with me that that's a totally different thing? That's a black mark on the idea of risk taking and innovation, but it shouldn't be seen as a kind of indicative of anything other than it was badly managed contracting. Oh, sorry, you're muted, Sonia.
I'd also completely agreed, but I'd also say and argue that there is no such thing as failure in innovation. I think you learn something every single time, and it's having that mindset to be able to embrace it. Like in some cases, some of the biggest technologies required 99 prototypes before the 100th actually worked. And so I think I really sort of challenge us as civil servants and those who work for the public with or for the public sector to sort of say, you can learn anything with every opportunity, with every experience. It's just how you're looking at it at the end of the day.
Okay. Peter, can we go back before I lose this issue of technology? Can we return to the issue of technology and the use of technology in driving innovation? What can we learn from these private sector players in terms of their experimentation and leveraging of technology that we might be able to apply in the public sector?
I think the technology is the tool that, and I don't think we technically use the tools much differently, but it's what we intended to get from the activities. I've totally agree. Prototyping and piloting is core, but governments tend to be really poor at that. I mean, back when I was in this public service, we used to have to sort of guess, and we'd do a pilot, and we'd get some data back, and we'd be able to sort of know whether we should expand a program or not. Now there seems to be a hesitancy to pilot and a push to launch. And so you're getting ahead of the stage of development of many of these applications, be they, pretty much every one of the tax measures we heard out of the federal system in the last couple of years. They announced them, and then they figure out, well, what did we mean by that? I mean, they hadn't piloted the idea. So there's things like, in our program at our university, we teach students how to think using some of the behavioral experimental tools to design programs and instruments so that they'll lead to the behavioral change that you want. Because if you don't think through the logic of why people do something different, you're probably going to miss the mark. Similarly, we push hard on the idea that we should be piloting things, not testing amongst your friends and family who are not independent observers, and then just dumping them out into the public space. Thirdly, coming back and using some of the behavioral tools for implementation. There's a lot of ways to better do it, but you don't know the right answer. We've got 100 different prompts. Which one are you going to use? One of our previous colleagues who's gone off to set up a lab at UBC was doing that with the BC government. They would take a real policy, beta test it using real people in an experimental setting, and be able to say, if you do it this way, you get 13% take up. If you do it this way, you get 20% take up. And it costs them $500. That's a lot better than dumping it out there, having a failure in the minds of the users, and then having to retrench and start all over again. It's a massive loss of momentum. And then the final one that I think we allude to, and we're slowly getting there in the scholarly space, but in public policy writ large, we haven't got there, and that's the use of random control trials. We do it in the drug space, we do it in chemistry, we do it in the regulatory space, but we haven't applied that tool very much to the policy space. Just as a signal of what's coming, The Economist a couple of years ago gave a Nobel Prize to a couple of economists who have been doing RCTs to understand labor market policy. So they don't just give everybody the same treatment; they give them 5 or 6 treatments, and there's controls, and at the end of the day, they actually know the policy works. We don't have that degree of sophistication very well embedded in the Canadian policy system. It's not to say we can't, because I think our new graduates are skilled in the knowledge and the tools that are available. It's just that there isn't a demand there. And if I leave a final thought, I think part of the demand is that we've got a disconnect between the people who do and the people who manage the people who do. I've been around this world enough to remember Crispo's study in 1962 for the Pearson government that came out under Pearson, which said that a manager is a manager is a manager. And so we went from having managers who knew something about what they were managing to managers who have an 18-month appointment. They barely learn who their direct reports are and learn how to work with the minister's office before they're bungee jump to another portfolio. And that's regressing down right into the policy space and the senior operational space. So it's really hard to find anybody in Ottawa that knows what they're doing. And that's increasingly true at the provincial level. Not as bad. There's people with real tenures in provincial ministries. But I think that means that when you want to do these things, there's nobody above you who can understand what the problem is, or why would you not just give me a solution and let me get on with my day job. So I think there's a variety of challenges here. There's the tools there. but I'm concerned about the ability to connect with the managerial capacity to advance these tools in implementation.
Right. Yes. The era of the generalist, indeed. Sunil, can I pick up on Peter's point about experimentation and ask if there's any problems with basic principles of democracy, that people are treated equally? What, if I'm going to push back on that, is there a problem with providing a benefit to some people and not everybody? Is there a problem with imposing a constraint or a requirement on some, but not all? How do you respond to that? You're muted, Sunil.
You'd think I'd never been on a virtual call before. So I could take Peter's comment personally, because in all of my civil service assignments, I don't think I'd ever spent more than 2 years anywhere. So I might be a symptom of the problem rather than part of the solution. But yeah, in terms of the
just as an aside, I spent 7 years as an ADM in one ministry, and at the end of the day, they felt compelled to move me because I was a block on what they wanted to do because I knew too much. So there's a balance.
I knew too much. Nobody's ever accused me of knowing too much, so I haven't had that problem. But yeah, I mean that is an issue. I think a little bit in the private sector, you can kind of try something out in a market in a province and see what works. Like, we're going to try a new chicken sandwich in Sarnia, and we're not going to try it in the rest of the province. If you start doing that as a public sector organization, as a provincial government or a federal government, what's going to happen? The media, the opposition are going to say, they're going to be baying like hounds. Like, how dare you provide this service or this benefit to a particular subset of the population? I mean, we kind of went through this a little bit in Ontario about 5-6 years ago, when the previous Liberal government was looking at the idea of a basic income, and they were starting the groundwork for piloting the program in, I think it was 3 different communities. New Conservative government came in and promptly canceled the pilots. But I was actually a little surprised there wasn't as much public opposition to just the fact that pilots were being tried. I mean, people may not have agreed with basic income or not, but I think people generally understood that this could be a very big and expensive program. We need to try it out in a couple of places first. So I think there could be a kind of theoretical concern there, but we're probably not giving the public enough credit for their understanding of why a pilot would be valuable, in terms of it could well save huge amounts of money if it bears out that a trial didn't work and we didn't want to scale it up across the country or across the province first. So I don't think that's a real obstacle to pilots. I think they can be done. I mean, governments do them in various guises all the time. I mean, they're probably not quite as public as the basic income pilot. And I think most people understand that we're trying to get more evidence and more information here. And in the long run, that's going to save you money as a taxpayer if we decide not to move forward with this, but it didn't work. And the fact that somebody had this for a year or a year and a half before I did, I mean, I don't think most people would really stand in the way of that.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And Sonia, I'd like to pick up on Sunil's example there, the Universal Basic Income experiment in Ontario under the Wynne government, because my recollection of that was it was about 1,000 people who were placed into a situation in which all of their various social welfare support systems were bundled into one payment, in which there was no clawback. They could earn additional income. And the objective was, as Sunil says, to see if it works, to see if it helps people gain employment and employment skills and increases their overall welfare. But the issue I want to explore there is the issue of scaling. So in a lot of ways, Peter, for example, talked about pilots as, well, try it at a small scale, see if it works before you roll it out. The UBI experiment was interesting because it may have worked for 1,000 people, and maybe we could have demonstrated for 1,000 people, but the scaling problem becomes something different. Once you convert an entire province of several million people, or however many people are drawing those benefits, you then have network effects. You have economy-wide effects that might emerge. So is there some programs in which scaling might not be as straightforward as saying it works at one level, so therefore it'll work at a wider level?
I think in short, yes. But I think governments, particularly given the mandate that they have, try to scale all at once, right? So to go from idea to scale all at once, given especially if you think of the federal government of trying to hit all 40 million Canadians at once, go through the testing, the debugging, the French conversion or the French translation, for instance, thinking about digital literacy and what about those people who can access things. And you can imagine in doing that, in order to need to get everything right, that's where the slowness comes in, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if you sort of say to yourself, scaling will not always work, but at least you have something to build on.
Yeah.
So you're not necessarily creating something for the big bang idea, getting it perfect, launching it, and then realizing it didn't actually meet the need, or there was an issue that was not foreseen, but actually saying, you know what, it's okay to go incrementally and go 10% of the time, 20% of the time, learn, build, confront some of those issues with scale and tweak them. But at least at that point, you're not slowing things down, and you're also saying, I don't need to be perfect right away. And I think it goes back to the risk aversion we talked about at the very beginning, which is if you create something net new that hasn't been done before, and your expectations are that it needs to be 99.9% right in order to at least see a prototype out of there or V1 out of there, that's going to take a long time. That's going to take a lot of stress testing, a lot of assurance. But I think you're also finding that in the speed at which that happens, the 99.9% that was envisioned on day one is no longer there. And so you're actually a step behind because technology has advanced or the needs have changed. And so you're constantly on the back foot as you work through things. And so that's, I think, the different approach. And so if you think about COVID as an example, when they actually had the vaccine passport, it went out to all Canadians, or in this case, it was provincial in nature. It changed format 3 or 4 times, and that was okay. But at least they were able to have a V1 and a V2 that was workable. Yes, there were issues with fraud, but that didn't stop them at least in getting something out the door because the economy and the people and businesses badly needed it. So I think there are some lessons learned in terms of scale. And I just think scale can't be used as an excuse of sorts or a reason for slowness at the same time.
Excellent. That's great. I'd like to give the audience a sense of some examples of innovation in the public sector. I'd like to go around and get each of you to, if you have an example to mind of someone who's doing something right or did something really interesting. Peter, can I start with you? Do you have anything top of mind of innovation?
Let me throw a couple of ideas, and I'm going to avoid some of the really contemporary stuff because they're still works in progress. If we're talking about processes of government, some of you who are historians of how governments used to operate, they used to just spend money. They didn't have any macro function. They didn't have any real policy coordination. And interestingly, Saskatchewan, where Justin and I come from and are housed, invented the idea of a treasury board. It didn't exist before that. It was the first one in the British Commonwealth. And the Americans then took it on and made it into their CBO. The idea of holding companies for crown corporations that would have a macroeconomic one was also an idea that was gestated here. So those are process ones. Programs, you can look at pretty much everything government does today. Those are innovative. They didn't exist 50 years ago, or if they existed, they didn't exist in the current form. The significantly progressive taxation, the environmental policies, the farm policies, they have been evolving. I guess the one thing that I perhaps end on is that I think governments have by necessity and by design recognized that they can't just do it all within the public space anymore. That back when governments were 5% of the economy 100 years ago, you didn't really need to work with the rest of the world. But now that they touch and influence more than half of the economy every year, they can't do their business without engaging and talking. And so I think the whether we call them partnerships or contracts or devolution and outsourcing, that model I think has been a major innovation in my career because most of it was not done before. Now it's a standard counterfactual to the government doing it itself. And that's what every company does. You know, the basic lesson of what is a firm from Coase way back in 1932 was companies do things in that are cheaper to do in than contract from out. And that's all governments are learning 100 years later, that maybe that's a good model, because not all of it is public in the normal sense of the word.
Uh-huh. All right, interesting. So, Neil, do you have a good example for us of someone who's doing something really interesting?
Yeah, similar to Peter, maybe I'll just throw out a few very, very quick different examples. So, I mean, a good recent example of innovation born of necessity was the Canada Emergency Response Benefit. So, I mean, we've been talking about employment insurance reform for decades, and then suddenly within the span of 3, 4, 5 weeks, a new emergency response benefit was rolled out to millions of Canadians at a time that they needed it the most. So kind of when, again, I think Sonia mentioned, like when we do away with red tape sometimes, I mean, obviously red tape is needed in a lot of cases and it's there for a reason, but sometimes we can just do things, right? I mean, when we really need to do it, we know we need to do it quickly, it can happen. I think there are lots of interesting kind of process or structure innovations happening across the country. I mean, in recent years, at the federal level with PCO, Ontario, a number of other provincial governments are rolling out behavioral insights units to kind of use behavioral economics type approaches to try and tweak, whether it's like tax repayment or organ donation or a whole range of different services. That's an example. Let's try a kind of a relatively newer field of study and apply that in a public sector context. And then the third thing is I think there's a lot of really interesting innovation happening at the municipal level, because there's actually, I think, a lot less red tape in some cases and a lot more direct citizen interface. There's something when I was with the City of Toronto, 2019, 2020, some really interesting programs in the, again, early stages of COVID to scale up digital supports for small businesses. So they couldn't really deal with customers in an in-person environment anymore. So how do we get them online quickly? How do we work with tech firms to support that transition? How do we develop kind of the know-how and the guidance for maybe a 2 or 3 person company that doesn't really have an online retail presence? And that worked quite effectively in that time. So again, innovation's happening all over the place. Most governments are trying new things all the time. They probably don't get as much credit for doing that as they should. But those are just a few examples kind of off the top of my head.
Yeah, those are great examples. Thanks, Sunil. And to you, Sonia, do you have any favorite examples that come to mind of innovation?
I think the ones that Sunil and Peter have kind of referenced are the ones that I would share as well. Like I think I talked a little bit about innovation during the pandemic, and we saw that with the vaccine passport, but we also saw it, as Sunil mentioned, of just rethinking some strategies, right? Like even sort of thinking about alcohol sanitizer and recognizing where governments were good and where governments were not good, and mobilizing and actually bringing people together. So that was an innovative way to solve problems that previously required task forces and things of that nature. In the pandemic, we just didn't have the luxury of time, right? And so that was kind of lowering the red tape, but it led to things being done in hours or days as opposed to weeks and months, the way that it used to be. One of the other examples that I sort of have experienced kind of in my work here at KPMG is just rethinking benefits. And these are those kind of supports that government provides to low income or vulnerable people. And even just the knowledge of an awareness of some of those different programs. It's done by ministry, right? And it's done by silos. And there are data information sharing challenges with respect to that, which is a person who needs housing may not necessarily be a ministry that's responsible for housing, cannot share information with a ministry that's responsible for employment support. And so the individual is having to go in and tell their story over and over again. Not only is that reliving their lived experiences and potentially traumatic experiences, but it's a very inefficient model for government. So really trying to think about it from the citizen's experience of the journey that they have to go through, and actually recognizing that government's ways of working has to be retrofitted to what citizens want, not the other way around. A citizen shouldn't have to explain their experiences 10 times in order to access multiple benefits. It's telling the story once, going through that experience, and then government working to actually make it a seamless experience at the end of the day. I think that is the innovation that we're still working towards. We've seen bright spots of it, But I think that is just kind of saying to yourself, when you are organized as governments are, how do you actually think horizontally? And I think that's been a challenge for some time.
That's
And
really
let me
excellent.
just add,
Sorry,
the
go ahead, Peter.
specific one I think that is worth highlighting is where government, I think, hit it right out of the park, and that's the Canada Child Benefit. That was an inside job. They built it. They changed a lot of the landscape of the other supports, and we took child poverty from almost double digit down well below single digit. It was a massive change in 4 or 5 years. Very hard to find policies in Canada or around the world that have such a material effect in such a short period of time.
But Sonia, to pick up on that and your point about sort of the what I call an ask me once method, when I studied digital governance in Estonia, this was one of the principles that they rolled out their approach was a citizen should only be asked a question once. If it's relevant to a number of different places, that should be linked up horizontally. Do we have a particular problem in Canada? Not that we're unique in a federal system, but does federalism pose a particular problem in terms of this, the duplication of processes?
I wouldn't say, and I mean, Peter and Sunil can challenge me. I wouldn't say it's federalism. I'd say it's government structure, right? And actually thinking about delineated vertical responsibilities and the way that it's structured. So for instance, I was part of an expert panel on youth employment. And my mandate was to take a look from a federal perspective of the programs that were being delivered for youth anywhere between 15 and 29. And the first question that we as panelists asked the federal government was, what programs do you provide to youth? And they weren't able to answer the question in a very quick period of time because they don't think about it that way. They're like, go to this ministry or go to this department who has a couple of them, go to this one. And if you actually think about it, it's a natural question to say, okay, what is government doing for seniors? What is government doing for youth? What about racialized women? What about Indigenous? You can't ask that question because it's requiring that horizontal view across government. But it's a natural question that the layperson or the citizen or the voter would naturally ask. But it requires a ton of collaboration, a ton of reconciliation, different definitions to actually think about it from a citizen perspective.
Peter, did you have a
yeah, I was just going to give you an example that's in the news these days. That is that everybody in Canada is on the federal radar in some data bank. We know who is not filing their taxes. The people who don't file taxes often don't have enough income to be taxable. What they're giving up is $1 billion of benefits. Most other advanced industrial economies are starting to do automatic filing for you. You can override it, but it means you get your benefits. And it just seems somewhat unacceptable in an advanced industrial economy to exempt people from access to public programming because they didn't ask for it, even though they're entitled to it under law and under practice.
Yeah.
But I think, Peter, one other option that I think we saw during the pandemic was the null scenario, which is assume everyone is eligible at the beginning, right? And instead of going through the eligibility criteria determination, right? And it's like, okay, we're gonna have after fraud, like afterwards, actually look at fraud, determine compliance, determine whether the money went to the right people, audits. But that you didn't actually need to submit a ton of forms, a ton of pay slips in order to demonstrate that. And I think some of the programs are saying, let's assume, given the risk tolerance, that everyone is eligible. And then actually think about the scenario of, did it work? What fine tuning is required? And I think that's just a different way of thinking about it, right?
Let me move on. Peter, you were speaking a few minutes ago about the idea that government doesn't have to do everything itself and should work with other partners. So let me push back a little bit. It sounds like easier said than done. How does government go about doing this, partnering with different delivery mechanisms or different collaboration pathways?
The ones that get a lot of angst are the ones where they're high profile ones where we're dealing with a for-profit venture. The really controversial ones are in the healthcare space where we work with for-profit delivery of surgical and other services, diagnostic services. That bothers people. But probably we spend as much or more effort working with community level operators. With our program has a third to a half are students who are migrants, and they work with the Open Doors Society, which is the frontline delivery for the federal government for dealing with migration services. And so there are a lot of good models. I think we need to get away from the idea that everybody that you're working with outside of government is doing it because they want to rip you off. That's a perception that somehow they're getting rich by selling back to government things government could do by itself. In a lot of cases, that's not true. There are some cases where there's a debate about what's the dividing line between the state and the market, but there's this whole third sector, the collective sector. It's partly at the community level, it's partly at the industrial level, it's partly at the social level, sometimes in the economic space, and they have a lot of the tools and the capacity that the state could never have in-house. And so finding a way to work with them in partnership rather than in conflict, I think is probably going to be a necessary requirement for public policy over the coming years.
Mm-hmm. So Neil, is there a balance to be struck in terms of engaging with, let me the private sector in a way that doesn't continually hollow out the public sector, that hollow out the state, that we still build capacity within the public sector while at the same time partnering where appropriate with the private sector?
Yeah, absolutely there is. And I mean, I think given the types of challenges we're facing, we shouldn't expect nor want the public sector to be all things to all people. Like, we've got lots of expertise in the private sector, in the community sector, in academia, in other spots. How do we think about like, it's kind of the basic program review type question, like, is there a role for government in this space? And then kind of go down the list, like, what could that role look like? Is it directly delivering a service? Is it potentially creating a regulatory framework or structure for others to deliver the service? And then asking a set of questions like, which is the best approach or set of approaches? It might be a variety of approaches in a given context. And I don't think we do that enough in Canada. We kind of just think about, I mean, and healthcare is like the third rail here. Like, we can't talk about it like it has to all be publicly delivered. But at a certain point, like, we could have a publicly funded model that's delivered by other actors, and it meets the same kind of conditions we want to meet under the Canada Health Act, and it makes sure we're delivering healthcare in an appropriate and equitable way. Because right now we're not. I mean, we're facing a crisis in the healthcare system with our current structure. So, I mean, there's kind of probably two main approaches to get out of that. It's like throw huge amounts of money at the existing system, or throw some extra money at the existing system, but think differently about how we deliver, and are there more efficient ways to deliver. And that doesn't mean undermining a public healthcare system. It just may mean thinking differently about who's actually the delivery agent there. I mean, the kind of classic quote you get in a lot of master's programs is like, government doesn't need to necessarily row the boat, right, at all times. Like, it's about setting the direction and letting others row. And I'm not a big proponent of new public management theory necessarily. I think there's been lots of kind of failures of government partnerships with the private sector, but I don't think that's because they're inherently doomed to fail. I think it's because those specific examples haven't been set up or structured appropriately. We really need to think about, like, what are the incentives in place here for the private sector and the private or nonprofit delivery agent, and how much do we want to kind of drown that external partner in red tape, tons of terms and conditions, or how much do we want this to be a genuine collaboration where we're giving them some discretion over how the service is delivered, to make adjustments on the fly? We're not just kind of sticking them with a template and saying, you've got to stick with this and fill out 100 forms to show us that you're sticking with what we set up. Because then we're kind of strangling the innovation that we initially hoped to get when we set up the partnership in the first place. So I mean, I think governments want to partner, but their instinct is to drown things in red tape. And then you're kind of defeating the whole purpose of the partnership, which is taking advantage of the expertise and flexibility that these outside agents have. So we need to get to a better kind of balance point where work together, but don't drown in red tape, and give them some autonomy in those spaces to do what they do best.
Excellent. That's great. Sonia, I think a lot of people in the audience will be interested to know, in terms of as they develop in their public sector career, how they can be most effective in both promoting and engaging with innovation, as well as the specific point about engaging with partners, whether they be private sector or nonprofit. So what kind of specific skill sets and resources do you think public servants need to be effective innovators in this new era?
I think there's a couple things that come to mind for me. I think it's recognize the innovation that you are doing on a daily basis and embrace it, recognize it, give yourself credit for it because you are innovating every single day in your careers. So I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is actually being able to sort of say and distance yourself or be able to sort of make a distinction between incremental thinking versus out of the box thinking. And know when you're in that situation and the criteria around you that is leading to one versus the other, and recognize that sometimes to escalate or to have conversations where you think those barriers or blockers are coming through. So it may be, hey, I need this, I need that, and be willing to sort of voice it, create the business case for it. And I think the third thing is work with your colleagues and work as your career to actually change the culture of your organization, which is kind of as you move up into leadership roles to allow for that change in the risk culture. And actually say to yourself, I have a role here to change the culture of my organization. I recognize it's hard within the public sector walls, but we've had so many examples of it happening. So it can happen. We just have to recreate those criteria, those examples, and say to ourselves, it worked here, let's replicate them.
That's really good. That's really good. I wanted, Peter, if I can start with you on the question of the possibility, I'm going to go out on a limb, the possibility that we may have a new federal government next year. How does one prepare for these kind of transitions when you're trying to promote and engage with innovation? Is this something you can pass along in terms of your experience from government on how you can?
So I went through 4 major elections in a provincial system, once in a central agency and 3 times in a line ministry. And if you're whether you're in the line or central functions within your ministry or within the broader system, that should be not a quiet time. That should be a busy time. I mean, clearly it's a closed door period. The writs require you be unseen and unheard, but it's a time when it doesn't matter whether government changes or not. All the plans on the wall get ripped off, thrown in the bucket, and they can start over. So I've seen governments that are the same people come back and do something completely different. So they're looking for ideas. This is an opportunity to affirm to yourself and through the evidence that parts of your program and policy space are functioning well, and if there's improvements possible, to articulate and define those. But it's also a time when you can essentially do a full zero-based budgeting and say, hey, there's parts of our portfolio that are not working, and they should be X'd out. And there's some areas that are within our portfolio that we're not properly addressing, and there's some opportunities. So this is really it should be an intense period. Too often when I turn up at governments, when there's a writ on, I see everybody out having coffee, and I'm wondering, how can you do that? Because it doesn't matter whether you're getting the same minister back or a minister from a different color. They're going to want a new briefing, and so it's coming. And this is a real opportunity to be innovative, to push to really imprint on where your professional advice can be foundational to a ministry. You really only have a very narrow window. I mean, governments after 2 years are usually locked in. And if you're not on the train with an agenda item that matters, you've got to wait until the government changes again, unless a crisis happens. So this is a really exciting time, both provincially in Saskatchewan and federally in Ottawa, for people who think we could be better. We could stop doing things that are redundant and do new things. And this is an opportunity to actually marshal the evidence and the logic that will support that.
So, Neil, would you concur with that a change of government or change of minister is an opportunity to be seized for innovation?
Yeah, 100%. We always talk about policy windows in government. So whether that's a budget or a throne speech or any kind of event like that, and an election is probably the biggest window there is. Like, you've got a new government potentially coming power at the federal level for the first time in 10 plus years at that point. It'll be what are your big ideas? Like, what might you want to put in front of a minister in that first briefing if you're in the federal family, or if you're at a provincial level of government, when your premier or your intergovernmental affairs minister is going to go talk to their new counterpart at the federal level? Like, what are the one or two key things you would want them to put in the window with that new government? So, I mean, I led the transition and election planning in 2021 in the federal government for one of the bigger federal departments, and we just treated it like a really great opportunity to spend several months basically acting like a think tank. Like, let's scan the environment. What's going on? Are there things we would want to do differently if we were our department going forward? Are there things we don't want to do anymore, or would recommend we don't do anymore? And you have to do that within the political context that you're anticipating. So if we anticipate a conservative federal government, like, now is the time to start reading the tea leaves. Like, what is the leader saying? What are kind of the signals about key priority areas, key types of approaches on certain files? And those don't have to be determinative, but it would be foolish to completely ignore them and just walk in and say, we haven't paid any attention to what you're talking about, and here's our plan for what you should do. Like, you kind of need to contextualize what you're doing with what they're saying. But that doesn't mean you can't kind of connect something that might not seem at first blush like a key priority area or key type of approach with what they're doing. Because at the end of the day, I mean, any government, like, they want to deliver results for Canadians. I mean, most governments, again, in this era that we're entering, they're going to try and do that with minimal new spending. So this is where innovation really comes to the fore. Like, how creative can we be? How much can we come up with new ideas to do more or do better with little or no funding? And any minister from any level, any political party is going to be very interested if you have ideas of that nature, because that's going to make them look good publicly, and that's going to be something that they're going to want to profile in public as well and in the media.
Wow, yeah, that's really excellent. Sonia, I'm thinking about this idea of new ideas. Sorry for the tautology there. This new ideas and where they come from. So I teach a course in strategic management in our graduate program, and we have techniques that I try to encourage students to investigate, everything from simple SWOT analysis through to foresight and scenario analysis. Or any kind of techniques that you use to get a handle on what might be new, a new approach to as environmental scanning? What are ways of finding out how we might do things differently?
I think, Justin, all of those ideas are good. They're true. They're tested. Taking a look at what's out there, taking a look at what research is happening, talking to folks, collaborating with folks, understanding what BC is doing versus Ontario is doing, being able to make those connections. But the thing that I found to be the most helpful in terms of thinking about novel ideas is crowdsourcing them. And actually thinking about hackathons, for instance, or actually having a day of innovation, so to speak, and you drop everything and you sort of think about things in a different way. So it's creating space in order to actually allow for that innovative thinking and taking that step away from day to day. So you can think about a general email box, for instance, which is employees have access to that, which is when an idea comes to mind, provide it to leadership. And there's a direct way to sort of go through it so that the people who are seeing the day-to-day come up with innovative thinking all the time. It sometimes is the small innovative thinking. But if you think about actually harnessing that type of information, even if you did 10 out of 1,000, that's real impact. And these are people who are informed on the day-to-day, who have really good ideas, but in government may not necessarily have access to decision leaders. And I think some of those small I innovations are equally as important. And I think crowdsourcing, thinking about things, creating those ideas for success, and actually creating and saying, you know what, let's see what we can do in a day. And Justin and Peter, like, you have case competitions all the time and you simulate that. And it's amazing what students can do in a short period of time. And you just sort of say, well, what happened there? I gave them really smart people. I gave them a problem to solve. It was multidisciplinary. They worked through it. They had access to a whole bunch of resources, and they come up with some pretty good solutions. And so I just sort of think that is a really good example of how do we take something like that and replicate it and actually say, our biggest talent sometimes, our biggest advantage and superpower sometimes is our team and our team's knowledge and our institutional knowledge. Let's take full advantage of that, absent the constraints of the day-to-day.
Right, right.
Justin,
And
can I,
go to
Justin,
that
can I,
day-to-day. Peter, go ahead.
can I add just one small thing? Because you started this round of questions about the election. And one good source of ideas is the platforms, but don't get slavishly attached to this idea. It can only be implemented if these people get elected. Governments are like magpies. You know, I've been inside governments when they've created their platforms, and then they see the opposition's platform and they say, damn, that's a good idea. How come nobody thought of that one? They're not going to say that during the election period, but they'll steal it as soon as they can. So often, if a good idea is a good idea, I mean, you can always get a different can of paint out to color it the right color for a government. And so I think that's what Sonia was saying. We need to think beyond the bounds of what is and what has been, and look for ideas wherever they are.
And I think just on that point, we talked about a change in government as a reason or a catalyst for innovation. And I think what we're saying, and maybe Peter, not to put words in your mouth, but another thing that I'm saying is don't wait for that. Innovation can happen today. It can happen tomorrow. That's a really big catalyst. But if you just wait for that, you're sort of saying, okay, I can only innovate every 4 years. And I think the challenge that I sort of would put out to everyone out there is you can innovate every single minute that you're working. You just have to sort of give yourself the criteria and the sandbox to be able to do it, and also the permission to be able to do it as well.
I really like this idea of the kind of either hackathon approach or a sort of a one, as long as we can get away from the day-to-day, as you say, Sonia, the grind of providing services, to step back and say, are we doing this the right way? Can we do it differently? But Peter, is there a way, do we have any ability within the public sector to incentivize this? I'm not specifically or only talking about money, but how do we incentivize the unearthing of good ideas?
Well, good question. I mean, one of my doctoral students, and you're on his committee, has been working on trying to figure out how do creative people signal what helps them to be creative. And some of them are what motivates them. Job performance and job satisfaction are core. Those are things that are within the power of any bureaucracy, and even any small unit, to enhance and improve. They're not doing it for altruistic behaviors, or they're not doing it because they're risk takers. They're doing it because they feel comfortable and motivated by the job. They also are motivated by participation and knowing what's relevant to their job. So irrelevant stuff is annoying. Relevant stuff is useful. You know, everything else is extra. Visions don't drive people, apparently. What does drive them is meaningful work, appropriate communications, and enough autonomy to have a sense that I did something, that I wasn't just a part of a group crowd scene that I can't identify my influence, but that at the end of the day, I can go home and say, hey, you know, I had a piece of that. I'm comfortable. I like that. I think we can do all of those things within the bureaucracy that's there today. I think there's a bit of angst and ennui in the system. And I think COVID sort of accentuated that, because people get isolated. And if there's one thing about innovation that all the literature says, it's a contact sport. If you're not actually contacting with people in a physical way, exchanging the same air, the chance of innovation is very weak. It just, you really have to work at it then. And the fact that many parts of our public service are still disconnected from the office environment is a challenge. And it may be good for the individual, but it's not good for the institution or for the public service of Canada.
Oh, you're on mute now, Justin.
Peter, you raised the red flag of remote work, and I'll avoid going there unless we get on a tangent. But Sunil, this is an interesting point about how to engage with citizens. How does the public service find out what matters? Have you got any kind of ideas or thoughts about how to get out of that bubble that Peter's talking about?
Yeah, I mean, it's creating space to think about these issues. It's creating space and time to go out and meet people. And you don't just want to go out and meet people when it's a crisis. I need to talk to you now because we're rolling out a new piece of legislation next week and I need to get your views. Like, you want to start talking to your stakeholders and when I say stakeholders, I mean as broadly defined as you could possibly think. Like talk to them on a fairly regular basis, even if it's not, you don't need something from them, but like you want to hear what's going on with them. Like they're going to appreciate that and probably be a little more responsive when there is that urgent, I need a response from you in 2 days on something my minister wants to hear back from. Like that's how you build networks, and it can definitely be done in person much more easily in some cases, but it can also be done digitally. You can kind of have digital town halls or digital check-in meetings with stakeholders. And just one other thing just on kind of like how we think about innovation. I mean, a couple of people have mentioned like the email inbox for innovative ideas, and like that is one approach. I mean, I've looked at this before, most employees find that can be frustrating because they have a good idea, they email it in and they never hear back from anybody. There's a apocryphal story from Treasury Board with the feds like 10, 12 years ago where an administrative assistant had an idea about very simple, very smart idea. We need to have an online booking system for all the meeting rooms at Treasury Board because people are double booking or triple booking rooms. So the Toronto Star, I think it was, did an access to information request on what happened to her idea. She was going to win like $1,000 under the Harper government for this idea. And there were hundreds of pages of briefing notes and documents about her idea. And she ended up retiring before she could have actually won the prize. So to me, that's always a hilarious story about like employee innovation programs getting drowned in red tape. But in the UK, actually, the Department of Works and Pensions, they trialed something that worked really well. They had they gamified employee innovation. So you would create an idea, it would go on a kind of like a public dashboard that was like a stock market. So people could vote on your idea, and some people would say, hey, I like your idea. Do you want to think about tweaking it? So somebody from communications might talk to somebody from policy, and they'd join forces and actually improve upon the idea. And they actually ended up implementing a number of ideas from that process. So I think that's a good way of thinking about employee innovation, to like create space for people. Say, I want you to spend a couple hours a week thinking about new ideas, going to talk to people from different ministries, collaborating with people. But if we don't encourage that, then it's not going to happen on its own because people are kind of drowning in their day-to-day, right? And if your manager or your director or your ADM doesn't say like, hey, it's okay to spend 2 or 3 hours a week kind of brainstorming and talking to people about something that might not be an immediate priority, it's never going to happen. So those are a couple kind of quick thoughts on that topic.
Well, that's fantastic. I'm a big fan of what's going on with the Canada Digital Service within Treasury Board, but to me, it's a bit too much like they're the kind of innovators and they go out and they help other departments be innovative. I would really love to see this kind of promoting throughout the government, throughout all governments, and that they take initiative to be innovative on their own. We're starting to move towards the end, and I just want to make sure that I'm conscious of the time. But Sonia, I want to follow up with one last thing. From a question that came in the chat, and to talk about lesson drawing from other jurisdictions. We tend to look to the United States a lot by default. Is the United States a useful exemplar in terms of innovation? Are they similar enough that we can draw inspiration from the United States, or is it a different structure of government and not really useful for us?
So we do jurisdiction scans for a lot of our work, and I would say we tend to use the UK, the Australia as kind of more comparators, just given the Westminster government structure. Mm-hmm. But I think the question uncovers the fact that comparison is hard, right? Because you're always sort of saying, well, the jurisdiction levels are different. If you look at Australia versus Canada, what a federal government does is more like what a province does here in Canada. So is it really like for like? And so like, I think there's lots of lessons learned, but I think in my experience, you can't just take the Australian model and put it in Ontario and expect it to work, or expect it to work here federally. I think you have to look at the principles or the spirit of the idea and actually use that as kind of the aha moment or the light bulb moment, and then see how it actually could work within our local context. I don't know the states well enough. It depends on the topic probably. But I think it's also a scenario which is, there's no shortage of good ideas out there, but you can't just say, hey, here's a good idea, I'm going to transplant it or copy and paste it into my structure. There is going to need to be that due diligence. And I think that's where public servants and that's where economists and things of that nature are really good at stress testing it. And I think it just goes back to what we said, which is stress test, but don't get in the way of that nimbleness at the same time.
Okay, excellent. I'm going to wrap up with a question to all of you, and I'm going to get you to think about, again, you have an audience of young public servants on the line, and one piece of practical advice that you could think of to pass along to someone just starting out and hearing this idea about be innovative, but at the same time, coming out of or into a culture that seems risk averse. So in the same order I've been going, Peter, if we can start with you, one piece of practical advice for a young public servant.
Be as open to new ideas, new ways of doing old things and vice versa as you can, which I think means have a very broad and diverse set of social or professional engagements. The more insular you are, the less you'll be able to see good ideas and advance them.
Excellent, thanks. Sunil, thoughts on new public servants?
Yeah, you have to think about it. The public service isn't something distinct from you. You are the public service. Like, you are the public service of the future. Don't kind of be a passive agent here. Like, you can make change. You can suggest ideas. You can meet people. You can kind of go out of your box that you've been assigned, and with a little bit of creativity, start kind of thinking about things differently and suggesting ideas, working new ideas into briefing notes or briefing decks, or in conversations with your manager or your team leader or your colleagues. So don't be afraid to do that. The culture of the public service isn't going to change without young people being at the vanguard of that change. It's not going to be led by the people who've been in the public service for 20 or 30 years. It's going to be because people like you who are new to the civil service want to change things and want to create better results for Canadians. So don't be afraid to step out of your comfort zone a little bit.
Excellent. And last but not least, of course, Sonia, any thoughts on advice for new public servants?
I think embrace curiosity, right? There are a lot of people within the public service who have been there a long time. And sometimes they say, well, this is the way it's always been done. But remember when each one of us was probably 5, 6, or 7, and we went to our parents and they said something and we said, why? And they said something, we said, why? And we did that 5 or 6 times, annoyed the heck out of our parents. But I think there's something to be said for that, which is be curious at the end of the day and say, you know what? Yes, it's been done this way for 25, 27 years. But a fresh set of eyes could say, you know what? Things have changed significantly. We may be able to do things differently. And I think bring together that natural curiosity, that fresh set of eyes with that institutional experience, who then can sort of have that debate in a well-spirited way of sort of saying, you know what, maybe now's the time to actually think about it. The conditions are different enough. There's new technology that makes us actually think about something that was previously left on the table, right? Mm-hmm. And in many cases, and I think Sunil can probably attest to this, which is policy is not done once. It's usually done over a period of time in an iterative fashion. And some of these changes are done to actually sort of think about solving an issue and going fire to fire to fire. And an example that I would give you from my own kind of client work is I was working on working for a client, and my task was to look at a government agency and determine whether or not it should still, its mandate was effective, whether or not the agency should still exist. And I asked the question, and it took, that agency had been in place for 50 years, and no one actually had understood the origin of it. And they needed to find a hard copy paper letter of some sort that established the mandate of that particular agency. And only one person in the entire ministry was aware of it. And it's been in place for 50 years, and no one actually asked the question until my particular project. And so, like, there is legacy and there is issue, but remember sometimes that a situation solved a problem, but the problem may no longer exist. Or it may exist in a different form. But we need to actually find a hard copy that somebody actually could scan for us to figure out why this agency was put in place.
Right. Interesting. And it just took that key question of why. Well, it now comes to me to draw this panel to a close. I apparently on the agenda have 5 minutes, though I don't have 5 minutes of what I could possibly say, because I started this I have a not literal but virtual Post-it note on my screen that says, "Don't be cynical." And this panel disabused me of that quite quickly. I had no reason to be, because I was just really enthused by what the panel had to say. The background that you brought to this, all the experience, the depth of experience on the panel, was really fascinating to hear your perspective on these questions. So I can't thank you enough. If I could ask the audience to provide with your virtual reactions for the panel for joining us today. Sunil Johal, Sonia Gulati, and Peter Phillips, thank you again. This has been an absolute pleasure to talk with you today. I learned a lot and really enjoyed it. So thank you again, and back to IPAC for your closing comments.
Yes, thank you, everyone. I really enjoyed, and I think I wrote like about 5 stickies and just on my thoughts from this panel. So a big thank you to all our panelists, a big thank you to you, Justin, as well. And of course, a big thank you to our attendees. I hope that you found it very informative as I did. Just a quick note that please watch out for a feedback survey. And the reason for that is we want to continually improve our programs here at IPAC Saskatchewan. And we'll be very pleased to hear your thoughts about this panel and other suggestions for pressing policy issues that we could discuss. If you're also interested in learning more about IPAC, please feel free to reach out anytime to me, Faith Babalola or Benjamin Olayole. Yes, have a good rest of your evening, and thank you again for attending. Bye.